planters a great level of control over the laborers, even though they were paid. Thus, as young historians, we must question the whole argument that Indian indenture was introduced mainly as a result of a shortage of labor. Have you heard that before? That it was because of a shortage of labor, therefore they needed to import Indian indentures? So we have to re-examine those things. But we must give credit, and we must acknowledge that the availability of ex-slaves to work on the plantations was also part of the whole condition in which indentured labor was implemented. Ex-slaves were generally reluctant to work for the low wages paid by planters. It was more profitable for them to invest their energy and time working on the small farm plots that they would have acquired after emancipation. Some ex-slaves preferred not to continue working on the plantation due to the psychological trauma experienced during African chattel slavery. So there is a count that, yes, shortage in terms of maybe you're not getting the readily labor from the available labor that is there. Because there's a large enough pool of laborers that you can pay, but the planters didn't want to pay that kind of wage that they should pay. That is why during that period you find a lot of people from the smaller islands, particularly the Eastern Caribbean, coming into Trinidad to work, because the wage levels in those islands was lower, or were lower than what Trinidad offered. But for Trinidad ex-slaves, it was not good enough. Okay? We must note, however, that Indian indentured labor was not needed in all Caribbean islands. This is particularly true for the Eastern Caribbean islands such as Grenada, St. Vincent, and St. Lucia. You should know by now that these three islands did in fact import Indian indentured labor, but the argument is that it was not needed in those territories, simply because the sugar industry had already collapsed. It was already on the brink of bankruptcy, and it was not profitable. In fact, most of the officials, the colonial officials at the time, thought it was an unnecessary expense. However, the planters, having control of the Legislative Assembly, was able to get the vote to import labor. But at the same point, it was not needed. In fact, the period of the sugar industry in these islands coincided with bankruptcy as they imported labor. So you clearly, and actually the export of sugar in that period had stopped because they could not compete internationally. So it was a waste of money, it was an investment that was poor. Experiments were conducted with African, Portuguese, and Maltese indentured laborers, which had all failed. And as a result of the failure of these experiments, they now turned to the Indians, the next available option. So they experimented with three main schemes before, and after failing in those areas, then Indians came the most logical option. Clearly showing you that it was not Indian labor that was really the crux of the matter, but indentured labor. The contractual nature of that, giving you the form of control, but yet a freedom that earns you some money to support the kind of economy that is now in process. We also had, which is connected to the last point, that planters desire cheap and controllable labor, high costs involved in running sugar plantations, therefore you need cheap labor, and therefore to sustain the sugar economy, you needed labor that was cheap. In addition, without indentured labor eventually, you could not have sustained the sugar industry in the Caribbean because that is the only labor source that was available. Planters did not have the means to invest in modern technology or the technology available at the time, and as a result, manual labor was quite dependent by the planters. So what the planters desired was a labor force that provided them with similar levels of control as existed during slavery. Given the nature of the conditions of the indenture system, the planters' desire was largely satisfied. In addition, the Indian indenture system was essential for the survival of the plantation economy. As I just stated, this is the reason that some historians agree that Indian indenture labor was the backbone of the Caribbean sugar industry in the post-emancipation period up to the end of the First World War. Now the current slide just gives you a breakdown of the countries in which Indian laborers were imported in the Caribbean. I just have some. We have to include Suriname there, even St. Kitts, but I just gave you the main ones that had larger figures. You notice you have Trinidad with 143,939 laborers imported. British Guyana had the largest with over 200,000, followed by Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia. So essentially the main point that we must examine when we look at the labor question or the Caribbean, the conditions that existed in the Caribbean regarding labor in a post-emancipation period is the whole development of capitalism in terms of its industrial stage, and therefore the type of labor required for that particular stage in capitalism. A labor force that was partially free but very much controlled by the planters. And after several experiments with particular types of indentured schemes, Indian labor became the most efficient and successful. Tied to that, Britain had control of India over a long period of time, and by the time the 1830s came about, they were in a situation or condition that were easily available to recruit Indian laborers and bring them to the Caribbean.
Now, as Dr. Sakran said, the Caribbean, there were reasons why the Caribbean wanted labor, but at the same time we need to understand why Indians were willing to leave India, or why Indians left India, because one cannot happen without the other. It was not a matter of only because the Caribbean needed labor, you had Indians come in. There was a reason for Indians leaving as well. So in order to understand why Indians left India and opted to immigrate to the Caribbean colonies, we need to understand what were the different groups of Indians who came here and where they came from more specifically. The first thing I want to touch on is the different caste group that came. The majority of Indians who emigrated under the indentureship system came from the villages and districts of, there's the areas they came from. They came from the villages and districts of the United Provinces, Bihar, Oudh, Bengal, and a minority came from Madras and Bombay. With respect to the Caribbean, most of those who came from Madras went to Guyana. In 1857, immigration from Madras to Trinidad was stopped as the Trinidad planters complained that the Madrasi laborers were not hardworking and that there were many problems with controlling them on the plantations. So we find that most of them who came from Madras went to British Guyana. British Guyana continued importing laborers from Madras straight until the end of the indentureship period. The second thing that we need to understand is that the immigrants represented a cross-section of the Indian society. The main caste groups that came were the agricultural caste, which comprised 39% of the entire laboring population, and low caste, which comprised 37%. But at the same time, there was a contradiction between agricultural caste and low caste. Okay, as some of the low caste belong to the agricultural caste and vice versa. So there wasn't a clear distinction there. So there are some problems in how we interpret these statistics for caste. In addition, we had 9% artisans who came and 15% Brahmins or high caste laborers. While the majority of the laborers were Hindus, a small percentage were Muslims and a few were Christian Indians. So with this background information, how do we therefore determine why the Indian laborers came? And in order to answer that question, we need to look at the economic factors in India. As Dr. Sakram mentioned, India was a British colony. British economic imperialism in India had a great deal to play with the fact to relate to the fact that Indians left India, to account for why Indians left India. We need to understand that internal migration in India was always common, that Indian laborers were already moving from their districts and villages in times of economic difficulties. Okay, so there was a custom of moving from one area to another in search of employment opportunities. And on this basis, we can say that the bulk of the indentured laborers who left for the Caribbean colonies made the decision to emigrate based on rational economic behavior. What do I mean by rational economic behavior? I simply mean that they made a conscious decision to migrate. Why would they decide to leave their homes and villages? Well, for a number of reasons. We know that there were serious periods of droughts and famines in India. At times of droughts and famine, there was an increase in the number of laborers who registered for the indentureship system. And we need to make a distinction again between registering and leaving. Not everyone who registered for the indentureship system actually left India or embarked for the colonies. But we do see some clear ideas that when there were increase in drought or when there were severe times of famine, increase in number of laborers who attempted to leave the villages was evident. The other factor is the loss of land. British economic imperialism in India saw that the laborer who was already limited in ownership of land had to pay high taxes. A lot of times they would lose their land because they could not afford to pay high taxes. And so they may have sought immigration as one option. There were also socio-cultural factors. We look at the notion of religious persecution. There were some Indians who left because they felt that they could not practice their religious culture, their religion in a certain way. For example, the 100% of the Christians who emigrated. I have found evidence in my research to suggest that some of those Christians or Indians were those who had converted to Christianity and who became outcast in their villages and districts and who may have sought the option to leave. In addition to this, we have the idea of caste, which I come back to, and lack of opportunities for low-caste Indians. We also had ill treatment of widows. Out of the total number of Indian women who migrated to the Caribbean and to Trinidad specifically, 34% were widows. And one of the reasons is that the widows were required to live with the family in the villages and they were often ill-treated. So you had a tendency for the female Indian or the widow to make a conscious decision to leave. Now, at the same time, we also have to understand that not everyone left based on rational economic decision, which I will come back to. Let me go to political factors. The best evidence of Indians leaving due to political factors was in the immediate 1857 era. In 1857, we have what is called the Sepoy Mutiny. That is the first, it's also referred to as the first Indian War of Independence. That is when the Indian Army or the Indian arm of the British Army in India led an uprising against British rule. What we had happening is most of the Indian soldiers who participated in that mutiny left or attempted to leave India for the colonies for fear of prosecution, for fear of punishment after that, after 1857. So from 1858 to 59, you had almost twice the number of Indians registering at the depots in Calcutta and attempting to embark for the colonies. Again, it does not mean that they necessarily were allowed to leave, because we have to remember that the ships would only take a certain amount of Indians. But the whole attitude is there, the attempt to leave, the conscious decision to leave. And I go back to my point about not everyone leaving based on rational economic development. We also had incidents of involuntary migration, involuntary immigration, where we had forced migration, and we saw this especially with female indentured laborers. Throughout the indentureship period, there were problems in recruiting the number of female indented laborers. In the 1860s, the government of India stipulated that for every 100 male laborers, there must be 40 female laborers. And the recruiters found that there was great difficulties in recruiting the female laborers. So what you had is a lot of unfair recruitment practices, and I know Dr. Sukram is dealing with this just now, so I wouldn't go into his territory. At the same time, we had high cases of kidnappings and abduction, although the lack of historical records or the shortfall of the historical record doesn't allow us to calculate the exact amount of kidnappings and abduction that occurred. And we also had enticement. I told you the story in the beginning of Munshi Rahman Khan, who spoke about two Muslim men approaching him and offering a job. And they basically enticed him into immigrating to the colonies using the whole economic factor, the amount of money that he would work for. So again, we find lots of stories of indented laborers who told tales of being offering jobs in Trinidad or land of sugar, where they would only have to sip sugar and not do any hard work. And I think here I'm going into Dr. Sukram's territory, so let me hand you over to him again.
Okay, I'll quickly run through the whole process of recruitment. I think most of us have an abstract kind of image in our minds how this process took place. So we just want to look at the institutionalized structure of recruitment on the PowerPoint. I don't know which piece is that. We're looking at the direction in which the process of recruitment took place. We started from the bottom of the pyramid and we're going to the top. The request flows from bottom to the top. So you have the planters in each of the colonies. Yes, you'll have the planters in each of the colonies requesting to the colonial government of each colony about the number of laborers they will need in any particular year. When that request is made known to the colonial government in each colony, it is then carried to London, the colonial office in London. That is the structure in which, or the bureaucratic structure in which this process takes place. From the London office, it goes to the India office. From the India office, it goes to the immigration agents, who will then hire recruiters. Is that clear to everyone? Okay, so this is more or less the flow or the channel through which the process of importing or making your order for laborers took place. That's how you do it for foreign used vehicles. Okay. Now the recruiter can be defined as a man licensed to recruit immigrants on behalf of an immigration agent. Now everything we talk about outsourcing today, it's no different in this system. The recruiter has the license, but he will then subcontract a sub-recruiter. Just like how TSTT will subcontract giving out their landlines. Fine. You have a sub-recruiter. So you understand how much levels this process has or entails. And as a result of this lengthy process, you can imagine the problems that will evolve throughout the process. Okay? Now in theory, or on paper, the Indian indentureship system was a well-structured system. There were mechanisms for transparency and accountability, nice words. However, in practice, the system was rigged with problems. And one of the problems of the system in itself is the nature in which it is structured. The planters, as I said, informed the colonial office and we went through the process. So I don't need to go through this again, but after the immigration agent gets his recruiter and the recruiter gets his recruiter, when he gets the laborers he wants, he has to send them then to the registering officer. When they go to the registering officer, they will then sign up that they have voluntarily signed on to indenture and therefore they are going without force. He will then, the process moves from immigration agent, recruiter, sub-recruiter, the registering office, then to the sub-depots. In each district or province that's described by Dr. Mahes, you have sub-ports or transient ports, temporary. But the problem here is that laborers will wait there until the quota that is needed has been satisfied before they take them to the main port in Calcutta. So it's a lengthy process. So you could be recruited today, but you're in this little cell or little holding bay till next week until the quota is made. And as a result, a lot of health issues emerged. Improper medical examination. You might be coming in and you are infected with something and you spread it to somebody else, as TB will happen, for example. You have other forms of viruses and venereal diseases. So what happened is that because of the lack of proper supervision, because of the neglect by the officers involved in the process, you had the ignoring of laws and regulations, which caused problems to be intensified. As a result, we had high mortality rates in the entire process of recruitment. We had poor medical examination, etc. So most of the laborers invariably will end up being sick by the time they reach Calcutta. Yet, at Calcutta, the surgeon or the medical doctor who has to certify that they were fully examined and therefore passed as healthy to be shipped to the colonies, he will still, despite they being sick, sign off stating that they were in fact in good health and shipped to the colonies. And what will happen then is a process where the colonies will receive laborers that were not healthy. In fact, in Trinidad in 1901, for example, continued to blame the recruiters and the immigration process for the poor health state of most of the laborers imported. Because you know, with an unhealthy laboring population means expense for the planters, means loss of time at work, and therefore affects their bottom line then on the sugar economy. So there's a problem with health and labor because of the poor practice methods and lack of following the regulations in the system. The main point being made here is that she has touched on it before, that the recruitment process was not ideal in practice, but in theory, as most things in this world. The fact remains is that forced migration took place. Not everyone who came to the Caribbean came voluntarily. Kidnappings took place. There are several stories to support that point. She mentioned one to you. And also, the process in itself, because of the demand for labor and the way in which the subcontracting took place, left a lot of room open for abuses and other problems. So just this is a general summary of how the recruitment process occurred. Thanks.
So what happened when the laborers, when sufficient numbers of laborers were recruited? They were taken from the sub-depot, as Dr. Sakran mentioned, to the main depot. And the main depot was located at Garden Reach in Calcutta. At the main depot, they were supposed to be examined by a medical doctor. Some were, most were not. And once a ship had arrived and the ship was ready to leave, they would embark for the colonies. Now, the contract for the transportation of laborers from India to the Caribbean colonies was given to James Norse Shipping Company. James Norse Shipping Company was established in the early 1800s, and James Norse purchased the entire company in the 1840s, and in 1875 he was given the complete contract for bringing laborers here. Before that, individual ships were given the contract, but from 1875, James Norse was the only one responsible for it. The ships used were normally what we call three-masted schooners, around 500 tons. The length of the journey varied from 20 weeks for a sailing ship to 13 weeks for a steamer. James Norris had about 15 ships. About 5 of those made regular trips to the Caribbean. Now, you could well imagine again, for the same thing with recruitment, there was a difference between theory and there was a difference between practice. In theory, everything was in place to deal with shipping and to ensure that the whole process of shipping laborers from one part of the British Empire to another part of the British Empire, that is from India to the Caribbean, was a smooth process whereby everyone involved would benefit. So you would find that the government, British Imperial government, under the watchful eyes of the government of India, implemented many policies to deal with shipping, to ensure that things like overcrowding, proper maintained vessels, that the mortality rate and all these things would be decreased. But at the same time, in practice, you did not always find this happening. For example, the law stipulated that every vessel was supposed to take approximately 370 laborers. That is 12 feet per adult. Each adult is given a space of, what was it, Ron? 12 by 12 in maximum. But what we find happening is that after 1870s, not one vessel left with less than 425 indentured laborers. So you can imagine the overcrowding that occurred right away. As a result of overcrowding, you had high cases of diseases, especially different types of fevers. Venereal diseases were also very common aboard the ship. The vessels were mostly poorly maintained, despite stipulations pertaining to the exact way in which a ship captain was supposed to care for his vessel. And as a result, we also had high mortality rates. For example, in 1871, on board the ship the Fort, there was a mortality rate of 30% because of the outbreak of a fever. Well, once the ship reached the colony, once they reached after how many months of being at sea, they were taken, in the case of Trinidad, they were taken to the depots. From 1845 to 1865, you found the ships that came to Trinidad docked in Port of Spain, where the Coolie Depot, or the Trinidad Immigration Depot, was located. However, in 1865, another depot was established in Nelson Island. And this is this is a building that remains there today. The immigrants were landed on Nelson Island so as to prevent the spread of diseases which might have been transported from India. When they arrived in Nelson Island, they were registered in this little area that you see in there. So they would be assembled there. The protective immigrant would address them. They would be registered. All the necessary information would be taken down. This is what it looked like in the 1870s. That's a group of newly arrived Indian laborers. So basically, the whole idea of having a depot and of using Nelson Island as the point of embarkation was that the immigrants would have a period of rest. They would have time to recuperate from the long journeys. They would also be examined by a medical doctor. And their foods, stores, everything pertaining to the ship, their bundles would be fumigated. The authorities were very concerned about the spread of diseases, mainly because you did not want to have 300 Indians arriving in the colony and 50 of those are unproductive because they were sick. So they took great care in maintaining the physical well-being of the indentured laborers so that they could be distributed on the plantations as quickly as possible. So you had at the depot, all of them were supposed to be examined by a medical doctor. Now we saw in the depot in Calcutta where that was more in theory than in practice. But in Trinidad, that was something that was practiced because the indentured laborers were only distributed to the plantations when they were deemed medically fit. Once they were deemed medically fit by a doctor, they were transported by small boats to Port of Spain, and from here they were sent to the plantations.
Yeah, my name is Constantine, and I go to a presentation called Chigonis. Question I have is, what kinds of diseases were present? Or what were diseases present?
Okay, some of the diseases that Indians arrived with in the Caribbean were the same diseases they would encounter when they lived on the estates. And these diseases included yaws, which was a skin disease where you had a lot of sores, and generally in the Caribbean, when you had yaws, you were taken away from the rest of the community and hidden because it was a grotesque thing to see. So that's one of the diseases. Then you had malaria, okay, which was common both in the Caribbean and in India. You had something called jiggers, which is like a mite, which goes under the skin, and it irritates. If it's not taken care of, then it forms a big ulcer, and sometimes it would end up in amputation of a limb. You also had ankylostomiasis, which is hookworm disease. Okay, and this caused anemia because the hookworm would cause bleeding, and this would result in anemia. So these were the main types of diseases, but there were other fevers. And the other thing is the doctors in those days, they were not well informed. So sometimes they diagnosed a disease which was not necessarily what they thought it was.
The other thing that we need to know is that in India, they didn't have any major immunization campaigns. So you found that a lot of the diseases that were contracted on the ship, for example, they were not immune to them, and they just exacerbated when they got to the Caribbean. One of the other things that we found in our research is that there were high cases of venereal diseases. Not just, at the depots in Calcutta, normally at the main depot in Garden Reach, and then during the voyage to the Caribbean. So when they came to the plantation, those were also taken, those were just exacerbated as well.
Concerning the venereal diseases, one of them was syphilis. But the thing with syphilis that it is very close to yours. So often Indians were diagnosed with a venereal disease, and what they actually had was yours. Even today, it is still difficult to make the distinction between the two. So often they would speak about so many prostitutes came to the Caribbean, and they figured they were prostitutes because they had syphilis, but sometimes it was actually yours.
My name is Enyehoma Obika, and I'm the president of the Caribbean